Now we have discussed how it works with WPF and XAML. Before we go into the code, I want to discuss, compared with XAML and WPF, how it works with Angular. Now let's get started by again drawing something on the right-hand side. And my question again is, the screen is now any kind of operating system. The screen is our browser, in our case maybe a Chrome or something like this. Let's consider Chrome or Edge or any browser that is based on Chromium. Which system is responsible for drawing the pixels on the screen when you talk about a Chrome or Chromium-based browser? The answer is Skia. The Skia engine. Skia is a very prominent and widely used 2D graphics engine which powers the Chromebooks, which powers the Chrome browser, which powers Chromium, which powers Flutter, for instance. By the way, there is a Skia.net version, so if you want to just draw or generate images in C#, it's really simple, nearly trivial to write a little bit of code that generates a PNG, for instance, using the Skia engine. Skia is super powerful. This is the engine that very efficiently draws pixels on the screen. Now with WPF and XAML, we had a kind of logical tree describing the logical structure of the user interface. What do you use in case of Angular or in general the browser to describe the structure of your user interface? HTML. Exactly, it's HTML. To be more specific, it's not HTML. HTML is the text representation. If you are more specific, more exact, we are talking about the DOM, the document object model. Yes, the text representation of the DOM is HTML, but at runtime it is the DOM, right? Then the browser is responsible, the Chromium browser or whatever you use is responsible for talking to the Skia engine. It uses the Skia engine behind the scenes to generate a picture with pixels on the screen and draw it finally on the screen. Okay, so here you have the HTML DOM, and this HTML DOM is then used by the Skia engine to draw something on the screen. Okay, let's put it that way. So on the left-hand side, we again have, in this case, not C#, but in the case of Angular, we have TypeScript. In TypeScript, you maybe have a class, and this class, again, has, just as before in WPF, maybe a property, just as like we had it before, and now I would like to maybe change the content of this label based on the property here. How do I do that? I do what? Just like in WPF, I create what? A binding. A binding, exactly. We could, theoretically, again, in TypeScript, use the imperative code. We could use JavaScript or TypeScript or Angular APIs to grab a hold of one of these elements in HTML. Maybe you know document.getElementById, something like this. So we can grab such an element and then change the property of the DOM explicitly by code. We should not do that in modern applications. Just like we had in C#, we don't want to change the content of the DOM imperatively. We want to do data bindings, exactly. Now the syntax is a little bit different, but again, we have a one-way binding, we have a two-way binding, all these things. We have a button, we will talk about that. But I would like to focus on the differences between WPF and Angular. And my big question in that regard is, how does TypeScript and the HTML DOM and Angular recognize a change here in this property? Imagine you want to display a customer form, and you would like to display the customer name on the screen, and you change the customer name in code, maybe in response to a web request. How does Angular or the browser or whoever recognize the change? Do we have something like iNotify property change in Angular? Exactly. No interface. No I will write an abbreviation. No iNotify property change. There is no iNotify property change. It doesn't exist. So how does it work? How can Angular do that? We just write a property, to be more specific, just a field in TypeScript, and we simply bind the field to an element, and Angular does its magic. How? It's not an iNotify property changed. Have you ever taken a look at the package.json file when you create an Angular application and ever wondered what this entry zone means? In Angular we talk about we're in the zone. If you are in the zone, something magic happens, something magical happens. Zone.js is catching all events that happen inside the browser that might lead to a change in the UI. Can you give me an example in a real-world application? When would it be possible that something in TypeScript has changed that should be reflected in a change of the user interface? What would be an example? I give you one. I start with one, okay? A web API request. You call a web API and the web API request is finished. So the browser gets an event, hey, REST API call is finished. Here is the data. And guess what? Zone.js will hook into the browser's internals and tell the browser whenever an HTTP request is finished, tell me. And then Angular works with Zone.js so that Angular is notified whenever something like that happens, and exactly then, and only then, Angular is comparing the old value of the property with the new value of the property, and if that differs, it updates the UI. Can you think of other examples that could happen when you have to update the UI? Yeah, exactly. A user interface interaction. The user moves the mouse. The user clicks. The user presses a key. Hey, the user did something. Make sure that the user interface is still up to date. Oh no, the user is not always using the mouse. If you think of your processor runs with, I don't know, 2 gigahertz, something like this, and for him you are the slowest person, the slowest being ever. It can execute billions and billions of CPU cycles, and you're just sitting there having the hand on the mouse, and for a computer you're really very, very passive. And it is very, very smart in that. If it recognizes that something doesn't influence something else, it will not do in-depth checking. We don't go into the details here. But you are on the right track, but I will discuss that in a second with you. First, I need another example for what Zone.js has to trigger. Think of a clock. Imagine that you write an Angular application where you want to implement the ticking clock. Every second you need to change the clock. The user doesn't do anything. We don't have any REST API call. Timer, exactly. In JavaScript, in TypeScript, you can use the setTimeout method or variants of the setTimeout method, like the setInterval method. And whenever a timer or an interval passed, the browser will notify your application, and again, Zone.js will tell Angular, hey, a timer just finished. Maybe something has to change on the user interface. And then Angular will again look through all the different bindings. It has in the background a cache of all old values, and it compares all values, the new values, with the old values, recognize what has changed, and then Angular is super, super smart to recognize what it needs to change here in order to update the screen. Now in Angular, this isn't perfectly correct, what I've drawn here, because in Angular we have something which is a little bit tricky, but we have to be complete here. In Angular, we don't just have TypeScript, but we also have the HTML template. The .html file in Angular is not really HTML. The HTML template is really the Angular version of HTML. And this Angular version of HTML is then compiled to TypeScript, respectively JavaScript. We will not go into the details here. And then at runtime, this TypeScript and JavaScript code builds the HTML and DOM. It really doesn't build this HTML. In reality, in Angular, there is no HTML. There is no text representation. Because you write HTML, but the Angular compiler compiles that to JavaScript, and JavaScript builds the DOM at runtime. And the data binding does not work on HTML, but it works on the DOM. This is why I corrected you before, where I said, technically it's not HTML. There is no HTML anymore. Everything is really JavaScript. But that's a minor detail. If we just think of the HTML of Angular, that it is similar to the HTML that we typically use to write, then it's a mental model, and that mental model is okay. We just need to know that behind the scenes it works a little bit differently. Question. The DOM is just bits in memory. It is objects in memory. There is an input DOM object. By the way, in XAML and WPF, it's extremely similar. But it's also a little bit different. Do you want to know what WPF does with XAML, this XML application markup language? XML application markup language during compilation is combined to BAML, binary application markup language. This BAML is just a binary serialization of XAML. It's really just a little bit bits and bytes, but they are exactly like the XAML before. It's just machine readable and not human readable. And then WPF at runtime reads the BAML and builds the object tree, the logical tree from this BAML. This is different from HTML because there is no binary HTML in a browser. The browser really directly consumes HTML and deserializes it into the DOM. And with Angular, the browser does not see the HTML anymore because HTML is turned into TypeScript or JavaScript, and this contains code that imperatively generates the HTML DOM, the document object model. So we are not binding to HTML attributes in Angular, but we are binding to DOM properties. And that's a very important distinction, because not all DOM properties exist in HTML, and not all HTML attributes exist in DOM properties. There are differences. If you use SVG, for instance, the scalable vector graphics standard, it really differs. Yeah? There are subtle differences here. We'll not go into the details. So, as I said, as a mental model, it's perfectly fine to think of HTML here, but it is technically so that Angular has this version up here. Just to recap. Good. And we have the zone.js, and it recognizes all the changes. You said that, is that efficient? I mean, what if you have tens of thousands of bindings? Is this version zone.js so efficient that it can really handle tens of thousands of bindings? Answer, no. Angular has a very special mode which you can turn on for each TypeScript class, and it's called OnPush. Flips the whole change tracking mechanism on its head. OnPush says, Angular, ignore changes that happen based on web APIs or whatever. Never look at the properties and try to figure out what has changed. OnPush means that I, as the developer, have to explicitly tell Angular when something has changed. It's basically I notify property changed. Exactly, that's the point. So in WPF and XAML, Microsoft decided to go for the explicit way because it's more efficient, but it's harder. So you, as the developer, you have more work to do in C#. but the default is very, very fast. In Angular, the Google guys thought it would be nice to have a kind of default simple mechanism for simple applications. You don't have to do a lot. You just write the property and Angular will do a lot of magic. And once you build larger applications, you will know more about what's going on behind the scenes, and then you can pick and choose exactly those classes where you can't live with the automatic magic. And there you turn to the OnPush model. I will not show you code samples for that because we primarily prepare for the final exam, for the Matura, but you should remember OnPush because when you leave the school and when you enter the professional programming world, you will need to understand this OnPush model and also the observable model and our XJS. We did that at the beginning of this year. So this is the big difference. If we take a look at this picture and compare it to WPF, we have huge differences here. A 2D, very optimized engines, Kia, driving the pixels on the screen. We have the DOM instead of the logical tree. CSS does also play a big role here. CSS is changing kind of the template or formatting of the elements. CSS comes in here. It defines how these logical elements will look like on the screen. But CSS differs greatly from WPF and XAML's templating engine. So in that area, HTML, DOM, CSS are very different from XAML styling and XAML templating. They are two different worlds. We learned about this Angular stuff, and we have talked about how this works with TypeScript and properties and so on. We talked about Zone.js and we talked about OnPush. Question? There are many good blog articles. You just have to know the Google keyword, the search keyword, and this search keyword is Angular OnPush, and you will find good videos, good documentation, and good blog posts about this topic. So this was the conceptual part, and now I will go to my desk and we will do a little bit of XAML and WPF programming, and maybe next week or the week after next week we will do exactly the same in Angular, okay?